For shading, we're going to use the vertical line thumbprint. Now, this tool is narrow on one end, a little wider on the other, and which side we use is simply determined by what fits better in that space. So a lot out here in the vine work, I'll use that smaller end, and this tool, we're not going to have it flat straight up and down. I don't want the whole impression in there. I want it tipped a little bit. And we'll kind of walk that around there. Again, letting it come up out of the leather and just slightly move to the side. Now here this tucks down under that border, so I want that shading right up to that border. Any of these smaller sticker vines on the outside edge, we're going to be putting a little bit of shading into. When I do that, I really look for the smaller rounded edge of that. Some of these it's tougher because they're tucked underneath stuff so much. But where they're tucked underneath, we can just throw a little shading as they're tucking under there. It'll help give that different dimension in there. But this one here that comes around, that outside, that rounded edge, not the concave one here, but that outside edge, that's the one I'm looking for. I'm going to run my shading right in there next to that and kind of create that little highlighted ridge out on the edge of it. Follow that edge around. Here it tucks under that border, so we'll run the shading right to it. And then fade that shading off as it goes down that vine. So that's by tipping that tool, it softens that back edge and allows that shading to fade out there. Now this main stem that comes up into that flower, I'm not going to put shading in there. We'll make that one stand out a little bit different because it's different than the rest of those vines. Many times with the shading, less is more. So we got to remember, what is the goal when we're adding this shading? Well, the goal is to add depth and dimension to the pattern. So by adding that shading, we're changing that dimension. But if I get too carried away and shade too much, then all we're doing is pushing everything down. And there's no real differentiation in there. I don't even know if that's a word, but you get the idea. We're not making that stand out. We're just pushing it all down. So we want the difference in depth there to achieve that look in your pattern. So by fading that out, we have some that's shaded down, but then some that's smooth, and that's what's going to create some of that flow in there. You're really going to be able to see it here in a second when we do these flower petals, because we're going to have shading coming from the outside and the inside. Okay, with all of our vines done now, except for those two stems, we're going to leave those alone. Now let's start looking at the individual petals here. So that shading, we want to pull it towards the flower center. So I'm keeping that tool pointed towards the flower center. Out here, right out on that ridge, we're getting that little highlighted edge there. And then lightening and flattening that tool and fading it back towards that center. Again, that ridge is more where it's on the outside edge of that ridge, then it lightens off where it's concave there in the middle. That's helping to create this ridge. We have some shading, but then an area of not shaded. If I just mash that all down out there, it would just drop that whole petal off instead of creating this ridge in here. So the other thing is we have shading out on this edge, but now I'm going to pull some shading from that flower center itself. Be careful not to hit the seeds of my center. Now we have shading out on that edge, no shading in the middle of that petal, and now shading in that center. So see how we've created a lot more depth in there as opposed to these that are flat. And that's just by adding that shading in there. But if I got too carried away and shaded all the way down in that petal, it would just make it all a little deeper and darker and not actually create some flow to that. Walking that shading, again watching those ridges in there, and then we'll come off the center. Notice as I'm coming around that petal, my tool's rotating slightly to continue to be pointed towards that flower center. I'm not turning it like this to follow that curve, because then my shading will be running across that petal. You see one flower shaded and one not. How much depth that changes just by that little bit of shading in there. Watch too how close you're getting that shading out to that outside edge. Sometimes it's hard to get yourself to push it out there next to that edge. But notice by that just being right out there, it's such a subtle highlighted line there. If you get too far away from that, that's going to really affect how that looks.